All right, so this is part 2 of public speaking technicals. And in here, we're going to talk about gestures and movement. Okay, so the next part is gestures. And remember, if we draw our little person here, in case you don't remember from part 1, gestures have to do with what you do with your hands, particularly haptics and kinesics, okay? Now, kinesics has to do with the actual movement, okay, of your hands, okay? And haptics has to do particularly with touch or hand movement. So like kinesics can include like how you move your arms, for example. Haptics is more about like hand gestures and illustrators. Now haptics would also include, if we were talking about interpersonal communication, we would be talking about touching each other too. That's a haptic movement. But basically the main thing you want to be concerned about is the idea of moving your hands, moving your arms, and moving your body, okay? So all of this has to do with gestures, particularly kinesics and haptics. Now, those who are hand talkers, of course, have a haptic problem, right? Because basically when they talk, they have to move their hands, and their hands start to become static because it becomes one of these things where it just interferes with their message because every 2 seconds their arm or their hand is moving in some direction. And so we want to learn to deal with hand talking, and we want to learn to keep our hands at our side when we talk and use gestures that are more purposeful. Now, there are 2 kinds of gestures then. So the first kind you have are emblems, and then you have illustrators. Emblems essentially are speech dependent, are speech independent, okay? So what that means is that they don't need speech to get meaning. So they are speech independent. So an emblem, for example, has a direct verbal translation or dictionary definition, usually consisting of a word or two. So think of like the OK gesture, where you put your thumb and your index finger and you lift your 3 fingers up. We know when somebody usually does that gesture in this culture of America, or North America culture, that means okay. Now, that's pretty much it when you look at the gesture, or the thumbs up or the thumbs down. All of those are emblems, usually for something. They have a direct or literal translation. So waving at somebody, when you request somebody to come here, you usually wave them over, if you will. The middle finger, right, usually has a meaning. Okay? Now, the thing about gestures then is that there has to be a high agreement among members of a culture about what a gesture means. And also that with gestures, they usually only mean about 1 or 2 words at a time. So if you put your thumb up, all you can really say is yes, no, good, or bad. We can't come up with something like, I just went to the store yesterday, and when I was there, I saw a bag of chips and I bought it for $5.99. There's no way a thumb up can mean all of that, okay? So usually an emblem is speech independent, meaning that you don't have to have speech to understand what it means, and it usually means something that is very short and precise. Now, of course, you can play with emblems. So you might flip off your friend, for example, and the way you'll indicate that it's play is while you're holding up your middle finger, you might be laughing or smiling at them, like as if you're playing with them. So there's certainly ways you can play with the emblems. And sign language is another good example of the use of emblems. Then you also have these things called illustrators. I already wrote that down. Okay, so, and what I meant to write was that illustrators are therefore speech dependent. Okay, so illustrators are gestures where on their own you don't really know what they mean unless you know what somebody is saying. So, for example, like lifting your arm up real quick could mean all kinds of things. Like it could mean you're emphasizing something, it could mean upstairs, it could mean you're lifting something. So to really understand what this arm lift is doing, you have to understand what it is that they're saying to get a context for what this actually means. So, and there's different kinds of illustrators that you can use. So, for example, you have object-related ones where you refer to something concrete or abstract. So maybe when you're telling a story, you might say, I found a fish that was this big, and your hands will illustrate how big the fish was, because you'll have a distance between your hands that closely matches the distance between, or the length of the fish. You can have speaker-related gestures too. That's related to the speaker's mind or delivery. So, like, I don't know, you might put your palms up, like, I don't know. And so you put your arms up, and you're like, and then if you're certain, you might put your palms down, like, this is what's going to happen. I am laying down my palm. That's going. You can have punctuation gestures that accent a particular thing. So JFK had his famous baton gesture. Bill Clinton also had a baton gesture when he did the whole I did not have sexual relations with that woman. He was using a baton gesture, if you've seen that video. And then you have the interactive gestures that regulate dialogue itself. So when you're a speaker, you might, to indicate that you want the audience to respond, you might put your hand out and point at them. Like, so what do you all think? And then that invites the audience to then respond to whatever it is that you're saying. So here are the tips then for gesture usage. Number one, you want to establish a neutral position for your hands that doesn't involve moving. Okay, so you want a baseline, if you will, of gestures where there's basically no movement. And then when you need to move, you move it, but then you bring them back. Okay, what you don't want is this when you're gesturing. And I really want your hands to be at your side, because when your hands are at your side, they're more free to gesture versus when they're crossed over or they're folded on top of each other. That really limits your gesturing. And most of the time when you see people who speak like that, they don't move or they don't gesture very much. And you don't want to limit yourself in that way. So you want to do your hands straight down. And in the example speech that you saw, I think both of them, they are having their hands straight down. You also want to use gestures sparingly. That's the other tip. So you want to save big gestures for big moments, if you will. And if you're gesturing all the time, it's kind of an economy where, like, the more you gesture, the less meaningful it becomes. And you really want to save those for times where you're really trying to get something across. So you want to be sparing with the gestures. Now, here are the uses, and here's how it builds stage presence. So number one, gestures emphasize a point, okay? So gestures are good for emphasis, okay? And that's good for engaging your audience. They can also illustrate a point. And the point there is the use of emblems and illustrators. And gestures can engage an audience because, remember, you can invite audience response, or you can invite any kind of response, even a laugh, with a gesture. So you could tell a joke and then put your hand to your ear to listen for the laugh, if you will. So gestures in themselves directly call for engagement. Sorry, I'm still using not a good stylus. Okay, so they directly call for engagement. But really, it's more like indirectly, because you're not asking for it, but your gestures are. Like verbally, you may not be asking for a response, but your gestures might ask for a response. And then also, if you're going to use a note card, which if you're going to speak for my classes, yeah, the most you can have is an 8x10, or excuse me, a 3x5 note card, and that's all you can have when you're up there. And if you're going to hold on to your note card, then you want to hold on to it with one hand, and you want it down at your side. And you only want to look at it when you think you need it. Okay, so you want to use it to hold your note card, but you don't really want to two-hand your note card. Some people, like, they'll hold their note card and they'll start playing with it with both their hands. You just want your note card down on your side with your hand, and only look at it when you need to. All right. Lastly, we have proxemics. And proxemics, remember, is the study of the use of personal space in human communication. So this is how far you're standing from something. And I also wanted to include the use of the stage, or the entire use of the stage, when you're speaking. So the idea is this. A lot of times people, when they speak, they're a tree trunk. They don't move at all, and so they just stay in one place. Now, sometimes they can't move because they're at a lectern where the microphone is set and you can't move it around. So in which case, you have to stay there, and you have to compensate in terms of stage presence through other ways, through your vocalics, through good stories, through the use of gestures. So if you're at a podium, you should be gesturing more as a result. And with logistics, then, the idea is this. When you're deciding what you're going to do in your speech, you have to consider the environmental and technological features of the room and the constraints that you face. So proxemics is the use of space, and logistics, it's not a form of proxemics, but it's just another thing you want to take into account when you're speaking, and that's the environment, if you will, the use of the environment. So, for example, you may want to have a discussion in your speech with your audience, and that might be a good idea. But the problem is, you may be in a room where it's 1,000 people. It may not be possible, logistically possible, to have a discussion just because of the size of the room. Or if there isn't a microphone to pass around, then it's going to be hard to do a Q&A at the end of the speech because you can't hear people asking questions. So a lot of times you might have a really good creative idea to really get the audience engaged, but it just may not be logistically possible because of the arrangement of the room or because of something that has to do with the environment or the size of the audience. So a lot of times public speakers, professional speakers will want to see the room that they're presenting in before they present, because then they can get a feel for logistics. If the room is small, that might affect what visual aids they use. If the room is large and there's no camera to make it large for people in the back, they may not use a certain visual aid because it's too small, and you would lose some people in the process. So logistics are always something you have to take into account when you're planning your speech. What technology do I have available? What is the room like? And you have to know those things to really make sure you engage your audience effectively. Now, one of the things I try to teach my students in the classroom, and because you're presenting at home, this isn't as much of a deal, but in the future, when you're presenting in non-homely environments, there's 3 kinds of categories to an environment, and you want to learn to adjust the stage to what you're needing to do. So there's 3 kinds of arrangements, okay? So 3 arrangements in an environment. So first you have a fixed feature arrangements. So in an environment, there might be something called fixed features. Fixed features are things that are relatively permanent or slow to change. For example, if you're in a large room and the ceiling is really high, that's probably a fixed feature. There's nothing you can really do immediately to change the size of the ceiling of the room. The walls, how big the room is, unless it has something else to where you can take down a wall, it's a fixed feature environment. There's nothing you can do to change it because it's permanently part of the structure of the environment. So if you're in a large room where there's an echo, there's nothing you can really do about that because the large room is a fixed feature in itself, okay? Next, you have semi-fixed features. So semi-fixed features are features that are relatively mobile and somewhat changeable in an environment, but it takes a lot of effort. So, for example, you might have the placement of large furniture, and you could move it, but it just takes a lot of work to do it. Or you might have a rug or paintings or something that it's not easily movable, although it's not permanently fixed to the environment either, okay? So, depending on the arrangement of the environment, what you can do, you might be able to move some semi-fixed features, but sometimes you can't. And then you have non-fixed features. And non-fixed features are things like desks in a classroom. Those can move easily, and so you might come into a room and give a speech, and you might ask everyone to circle up, or you might ask everyone to break into groups, or you might ask everyone to do something where they move their desks. Hey, let's have everyone in a circle instead. Something like that. Because the features are not fixed, you can do that. So one of the things that I try to teach my students when they're up presenting is like, look, if you don't need the lectern, move it. If there's a table that you want to use that will help make delivering your speech easier for placing props, then move the table and put it in the center. If the table gets in your way, move the table out of the way. Like, don't feel like that however the stage is set, that it has to stay that way. When you're the speaker, you control the floor. The floor is yours now, and you can make the floor adjust to you, just as long as it's a non-fixed feature. Semi-fixed features, you have to use judgment on, like, can I move this computer and it's 5 speakers and wires? Like, I mean, obviously you can't, not enough time for that. So logistically, that's not possible. But for the non-fixed features, make the room work for you. Okay, so here are the tips then. Make the stage yours. That's the first tip. As a speaker, you're the pack leader. So if any of you watch The Dog Whisperer, Caesar Milan's all like, you gotta let the dogs are essentially a manifestation of your personality. That's part of the philosophy of his dog training. So if you're high stress, your dogs become high stress. And similarly, as a speaker, you take on a powerful role then. So you can move things around as you need to. You need to declare your territory. And that not only means moving things on the stage, but also using that territory by moving around on the stage and not just being in one spot. Letting your audience know that you can be wherever they are and you can meet them halfway. Now, with all that said, if you can't move around, compensate. So you can still be effective standing on one place, but you have to then establish command of the room in other ways. So loudness will then come into play. You're going to have to use a lot of gestures. You're going to have to compensate if you can't move for whatever reason. Now, in your speeches, I think you can move to a certain degree because as long as you're visible by the camera, it should work. So you have to establish what's logistically possible, because if you can have somebody hold the camera, then they can follow you as you move around. But I want to start seeing a little bit of purposeful movement in your speech that's visible from the camera. And then you can also use movement, and this is why it's important in especially my face-to-face class. You can use movement to signal change in your speech. So when we get to speech writing next week, you'll be able to understand this a little bit more. But the idea is that when you write a speech and you move from your introduction to your main points, you can signal when you're changing to a main point or when you're concluding or when you're changing a different tone by how you move, the timing of your movement. And we'll learn more about that when we get into speech writing. So the uses then of proxemics then is of course to engage your audience. And in this case, it's an attention keeper, because if you're moving around, you're adding some unpredictability to your speech, and that's good because then it makes people want to know where you're going, what are you doing. And it's also there to demonstrate transition and movement of ideas. So with all that said, that is technicals for public speaking, and I'm going to be taking these things into consideration. So I might say when I start looking at your speeches, you need to move around more. This is where it's all coming from, and here's the rationale for all of it. So all of these things you're learning, all of these aspects, I'm going to be grading you on as I watch your speeches. Okay? So good luck with them, and I look forward to the next lecture.